king with the most powerful empire on earth at his feet, a throne that commanded the loyalty of millions, all abandoned in an instant for a woman he couldn't have. But was it really for love, or was Edward VIII the victim of a conspiracy that would forever change the course of history? What drove a man born into unimaginable privilege to throw it all away after just 326 days on the throne? The official story, a king surrendering his crown for love, seems almost too romantic to be true, and as classified documents slowly emerge from dusty archives, historians are beginning to suspect it was. January 1936. King George V is dead. His eldest son, Edward, ascends to the British throne as Edward VIII, charismatic, modern, and wildly popular with the public. Where his father had been stern and traditional, Edward was charming and progressive. Women adored him, men wanted to be him. For a country still recovering from the Great Depression, Edward VIII was a beacon of hope and renewal. But behind the ceremonial pomp lurked a secret that would shatter the monarchy, for Edward had already given his heart to someone deemed utterly unsuitable, Wallis Simpson. Simpson was American, twice divorced, and, as some whispered, a woman with dangerous connections. Wallis Simpson was unlike anyone who had ever captured a king's attention. Sharp-featured rather than conventionally beautiful, she possessed a wit and sophistication that set her apart in high society. Born in Pennsylvania to a modest family, she had clawed her way into elite circles through a series of calculated marriages and carefully cultivated relationships. In the rigid world of 1930s British aristocracy, Wallis Simpson wasn't just unsuitable, she was impossible. The Church of England, which the king headed, forbade remarriage after divorce. For a king to marry such a woman was unthinkable. But Edward was obsessed. "The only thing in the world I care about is this woman," he told his staff. "I can't live without her." Their relationship had begun years earlier, while Edward was still Prince of Wales. By the time he took the throne, they were inseparable, though the British public remained largely unaware. While royal courtiers whispered in palace corridors, newspapers maintained a conspicuous silence about the affair. What was it about this woman that drove a king to madness? What power did she hold over him that made the ruler of a quarter of the world's population willing to throw everything away? While the British public remained largely unaware of the king's romance, behind closed doors, panic erupted through the corridors of power. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin was horrified, the Archbishop of Canterbury was outraged, and the royal family watched in stunned disbelief as their king became increasingly reckless in his devotion. When Edward began sending government papers to Wallis for her review, a serious breach of protocol, alarm bells rang throughout Whitehall. When he insisted she be treated with the deference due to a future queen, senior courtiers threatened resignation. But there was more to their concern than mere scandal. British intelligence had been watching Wallis Simpson for months. MI5 had opened a file on Mrs. Simpson in 1935, initially concerned about her previous marriage to Ernest Simpson, a shipping executive with business ties to Germany. They knew she maintained suspicious relationships with high-ranking Nazi officials, including Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's ambassador to Britain. Some reports suggested she passed sensitive information to the Germans. Others claim she was sympathetic to Nazi ideology. Was Wallis Simpson seducing the besotted king to gain access to state secrets? Edward's inner circle was increasingly alarmed by his willingness to discuss state affairs with Wallis, a flagrant breach of royal protocol. "The king appears to be under the complete influence of Mrs. Simpson," wrote one intelligence officer in a classified report. "His judgment is compromised where she is concerned." Special branch detectives assigned to royal protection duty reported that the king frequently ignored security protocols when meeting Wallis. He would dismiss his security detail, and more concerning still, he shared details of sensitive military installations with her during private weekend visits. His official duties began to suffer. He cancelled appearances when they conflicted with Wallis's schedule. He left important state papers unsigned for days while vacationing with her on the Mediterranean. And as 1936 progressed, Edward became increasingly isolated from his advisors, preferring the company of Wallis and her fashionable friends. The King of England was now effectively in a gilded cage of his own making, with Wallis holding the key. By November 1936, the pressure was reaching a breaking point. American newspapers had been openly reporting on the relationship for months, but the British press maintained a conspicuous silence until now, when the Bishop of Bradford publicly criticized the king's lack of spiritual understanding. It was a thinly veiled reference that broke the dam. Suddenly, the affair that everyone in high society knew about became public knowledge. Headlines exploded across the country. King's morganatic marriage questioned the Times. Mrs. Simpson to divorce proclaimed the Daily Express. For millions of ordinary Britons, the revelation came as a complete shock. The constitutional crisis that followed was unprecedented. Edward proposed a morganatic marriage where Wallis would not become queen. Prime Minister Baldwin flatly rejected the idea. The British government, the Empire Dominions, and the Church were united in opposition. The stakes couldn't have been higher. With war clouds gathering in Europe and fascism on the rise, Britain needed stable leadership. Instead, it had a king willing to plunge the nation into chaos for personal desire. Some in government privately speculated that Edward's erratic behavior might indicate he was mentally unfit to rule, a devastating prospect for a nation facing the growing threat of Nazi Germany just across the English Channel. On December 10, 1936, Edward faced the ultimate choice, the crown or the woman. And in that moment, something happened that still shocks historians to this day. I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love. With these words, broadcast to a stunned nation and empire on December 11th, Edward VIII became the first British monarch to voluntarily surrender the crown. After just 326 days as king, he chose Wallis Simpson over empire, duty, and destiny. The abdication document, hastily prepared and bearing the signatures of his three brothers as witnesses, legally transformed King Edward VIII back into Prince Edward. His younger brother, unprepared and stammering, became King George VI. A young Princess Elizabeth was now unexpectedly in direct line to the throne, her future forever altered by her uncle's decision. Edward, now styled as the Duke of Windsor, and Wallis were effectively exiled from Britain. The royal family closed ranks against them. Edward was informed he would not be welcome to live in Britain as long as he remained married to Wallis. But the story doesn't end there. In fact, it becomes even more disturbing, because what happened next suggests that perhaps the British government had been right to fear this relationship all along. But before we jump to the next one, I have a quick request. If you're enjoying this so far, hit that like button and subscribe. It helps the channel grow and lets us bring you even more incredible stories. Thanks for your support. In October 1937, just months after their wedding, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor made an unofficial visit to Nazi Germany. They met Adolf Hitler, toured factories, and gave Nazi salutes to cheering crowds. Photographs of the smiling couple, seemingly at ease with the Nazi leadership, shocked those who saw them. British intelligence was horrified but not surprised. They had been intercepting concerning communications for months. Classified files only released decades later reveal the extent of the concern. The FBI had Wallis under surveillance. They believe she maintained a romantic relationship with Joachim von Ribbentrop, who reportedly sent her 17 carnations every day, one for each time they had allegedly been intimate. The relationship with Ribbentrop dated back to his time as German ambassador to London, when Wallis reportedly provided him with sensitive information about British attitudes towards Germany. Some reports even suggested she had access to secret cabinet papers through Edward. Ribbentrop, later hanged as a war criminal at Nuremberg, allegedly described Wallis as the only person who fully understood the Nazi cause. Even more alarming were the Duke's own sympathies. In private, Edward expressed admiration for Hitler and Nazi efficiency. He allegedly told a friend it would be a tragic thing for the world if Hitler was overthrown. During dinner parties in their French home, the Duke and Duchess openly criticized Britain's opposition to Hitler, suggesting that appeasement was the wiser course. One guest recorded Edward saying that the bombing of Britain would bring the country to its senses. As Europe descended into war, British intelligence intercepted a German plot so shocking it remained classified until 2003. Operation Willi. The Nazis planned to kidnap the Duke and Duchess from their home in France, return Edward to Britain as a puppet king after a German invasion, and use him to broker a peace favorable to Hitler. German diplomatic cables intercepted by British intelligence discuss the Duke's potential usefulness. The Duke is convinced that had he remained on throne, war would have been avoided, read one message from a German agent. He is ready to take over position of responsibility if invited to do so. Winston Churchill, once Edward's friend, rushed to get the couple out of Europe and appointed the Duke governor of the Bahamas, effectively neutralizing any threat they might pose. For the next 4 decades, Edward and Wallis lived a life of luxurious irrelevance. They floated between wealthy friends' homes, threw lavish parties, and desperately sought meaning where there was none. Their years in the Bahamas during the war were marked by scandal and frivolity, while the world burned. While Edward performed his gubernatorial duties with reluctance, Wallis decorated their official residence at a cost that shocked locals suffering from wartime shortages. She was rumored to use her diplomatic privileges to smuggle goods and avoid rationing, earning the hatred of islanders. The former king, who once commanded an empire, was reduced to complaining about money and royal slights. The Duchess was denied the title Her Royal Highness, a wound that never healed. Meanwhile, the young princess, who had never expected to rule, became Queen Elizabeth II, one of the longest reigning and most respected monarchs in history. The monarchy Edward abandoned not only survived, but thrived under her steady guidance. The contrast couldn't have been starker. While Edward and Wallis drifted between luxury resorts and dinner parties, Elizabeth II rebuilt the monarchy's reputation through duty and service, precisely the qualities her uncle had rejected. When Edward died in 1972 from throat cancer, Queen Elizabeth visited him on his deathbed, a final act of family reconciliation. Wallis lived another 14 years in increasing seclusion, suffering from dementia before dying alone in 1986. They lie buried together at Frogmore in Windsor, finally at rest in the country that had rejected their union. The abdication crisis rewrote the history of Britain's monarchy. Without it, there would be no Queen Elizabeth II, no King Charles III. The entire modern royal family exists as we know it because one man chose love over duty. But the disturbing questions remain unanswered. Was Wallis Simpson a Nazi sympathizer who manipulated Edward for political gain? Was Edward VIII a willing pawn in a German plot to undermine Britain? Or were they simply two flawed individuals caught in extraordinary circumstances? Recent historical discoveries have only deepened the mystery. In 2003, documents revealed that Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin may have exaggerated the constitutional crisis to force Edward's abdication. possibly because he knew of the king's Nazi sympathies. In 2015, newly declassified FBI files suggested that Wallis had also maintained a relationship with a top Nazi banker during her affair with the king. And in 2022, private diaries emerged showing that even within the royal family, there were fears that Edward was being manipulated by German agents. The classified files continue to be released in fragments, each one adding another piece to the royal puzzle. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, a king genuinely in love but also politically naive, a woman ambitious for status but not necessarily treasonous. Or perhaps the most disturbing possibility is true, that Britain narrowly avoided having a Nazi sympathizer on the throne at the exact moment when Hitler unleashed the most destructive war in human history. And it's worth contemplating the alternate history. Had Edward remained king, would Britain have made peace with Hitler? Would the Holocaust have proceeded without opposition? Would democracy in Europe have survived? The story of Edward and Wallis remains the greatest royal scandal of the modern age. A king who abandoned his empire for love or something darker. We may never know the full truth, but one thing is certain. When Edward signed the instrument of abdication on that December day in 1936, he changed the course of history forever. And in doing so, he may have inadvertently saved the very monarchy he betrayed. What do you think? Was Edward VIII truly in love, or was he manipulated by Nazi sympathizers? Was Britain saved by his abdication, or was he unfairly vilified? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you've made it this far, chances are you love uncovering history's darkest secrets, so why not make it official? Tap that subscribe button now for more nefarious stories from history.